Good evening, Chatham-Kent. My name is Phil Monk, and I'm here from the Chatham-Kent Prosperity Roundtable, coming at you with another conversation with our friend Jeff Wilkins from the Chatham-Kent Legal Clinic. Before we introduce Jeff and get rolling for tonight, I wanted to just do a quick introduction. As many of you watching know, Chatham-Kent, like many other communities across Canada, is facing an affordable housing crisis. We have all experienced the increases in rental prices over the past 2 years with, frankly, no sign of it stopping or slowing. With this increase in prices comes a new issue in the affordable housing crisis, namely that housing is viewed as an investment opportunity rather than a person's home. Vacancy rates in Chatham-Kent are at a 20-year low of 1.2%. As vacancy rates go down, the incentive to end tenancies and increase rents keep going up. You might have heard of Renovictions before. It's a term that describes the eviction of tenants to allow landlords to renovate a rental unit. This is legal under the Landlord and Tenant Act. However, these types of evictions are increasingly being used to evict tenants in low-priced rental units to make way for higher-priced tenants. And that's where the problem begins. That is, there are legal ways of ending a tenancy, and there are also illegal ways of doing this. And that's why we're here today, to help you understand your rights as a tenant. The Residential Tenancies Act sets out the rules and regulations for landlords and tenants in the province. This act is intended to ensure that both landlords and tenants are protected. Where there is disagreement, that's where the Landlord and Tenant Board steps in to address the disagreement in accordance with this act. Unfortunately, not everyone knows what their rights and responsibilities are, and that is something we are working to change. Today, we welcome, as I mentioned, Jeff Wilkins, housing paralegal with the Chatham-Kent Legal Clinic, who will be going over some examples of situations that he and the legal clinic have recently experienced, including this new trend called cash for keys. He will explain the differences between an N11 and an N13. And in closing, he's going to share a few tips that might help. For example, if someone asks you to sign something quickly, don't. We are hopeful at the very least you come away from today's conversation knowing that you have rights under the Residential Tenancies Act. And whenever in doubt, know that the Chatham-Kent Legal Clinic and Chatham-Kent Employment and Social Services are here to help. Thank you so much, for joining us, Jeff, and thanks for being here.
Thanks a lot, Phil. Good to see you again. I just wanted to mention that, like Phil said, I'm at the Chatham-Kent Legal Clinic, and we're working remotely right now, but we still are open. So if you did want to phone the office at the number they just showed at 351-6771, we will be able to help you. We do work very closely with our supports, mostly with Chatham-Kent Employment and Social Services. I speak to them on a daily basis, and we're able to sort out a lot of these problems that we get involved with. So if you are in jeopardy of being evicted or you have any landlord or tenant issue, please get a hold of the clinic. We're here to help, and our services are free of charge.
Fantastic. Thanks for the great introduction, Jeff. And I have to say, I agree with you. Chatham-Kent Employment and Social Services is an excellent resource in this community. They provide a lot of different supports. They're not just Ontario Works. They have a lot of different departments that are working heavily to ensure that we have access to affordable housing, and more importantly, that people are staying housed just like yourself. So, Jeff, you're here today to talk about N11s, N13s, and cash for keys. Where do you want to start?
Well, let's start with the N13s. As many people have probably heard, also known as Renovictions. If a landlord wants to do any kind of work in your unit or whatever you're renting, they have to serve you an N13 if they need permits to do that work. A lot of landlords will try to get around the N13 because with the N13, the tenant has protections. They provide that there's compensation that has to be paid to the tenant. The tenant has rights to first refusal to enter the unit after the work's been done, and they can't increase your rent. A lot of landlords are saying, yes, you can move back in, but we're going to bump your rent up to market. they can't do that. They can only increase it by what the province has said they can increase it by. And this year, that's 1.5%. So a lot of times landlords don't want to do this because they want to get the tenant out of the unit so that they can charge more rent. This isn't all landlords by any means. There's a lot of great landlords out there, and Chatham-Kent's pretty lucky that we do have so many great landlords. But there are some that out there that still want to try to go against the grain, so to say. And you have to ask yourself, why wouldn't the landlord do this legally? Why wouldn't they give you an N13? It's pretty easy. It's the same amount of paperwork. Well, that's because if they give you an N13, you do have protections. And if you do tell the landlord you want to move back in and they say no, you can go to the landlord tenant board for a bad faith application and sometimes get 1 full year's worth of rent back. Also the difference in the new rent you're paying. And sometimes they can put you back into the rental unit. So there are a lot of saving graces with the N13s.
What I'm hearing, Jeff, with the N13s is that there's a lot of protection for tenants, and it's the legal and best way for landlords who are looking to renovate their properties, which is their right. It's a great thing to be doing, but that is the best approach for the tenant and the landlord to walk through. Can you walk us through what it would be like for a tenant who receives an N13? So landlord shows up with an N13. What's the process from there?
Sure. The landlord should first give you a 24-hour notice, but if they do show up with an N13, you don't have to sign anything. This is just a form stating what he wants to do. And for the most part, these are just so that they can do renovations. And the renovations have to be so severe that they have to get permits. So that's the first thing. You will get the N13 and they'll probably check off, we will obtain permits, but we'll circle around to that after. After they do give you the N13 has to be filed with the landlord and tenant board, and they have to prove to the board that they have obtained all the permits, that they filled out the form properly, that they've given the tenant compensation, and they've explained that the tenant can move back in. They have to do all of this in front of the member. And if they don't, they won't be able to do the renovations. Some landlords will give it N13 and then won't file it with the landlord and tenant board. And if they don't file it with the board, you got to kind of wonder a little bit why they didn't do that. The easiest way for landlords is to serve an N11. Because an N11 is just the tenant and the landlord signing that they are going to end the tenancy, and there's not even a hearing for that. The landlord tenant board assumes that both parties have signed this, and they've signed it in good faith, and so they just give an order evicting somebody. So you don't even get to have a hearing with an N11. So that's why I always stress, if there are going to be renovations, make sure you get the N13. That gives you all the protections, and it's the law. It's the way it should be done.
And that now, just I know we kind of switched that N11 at the end there, but before we switch over to N11s, going back to the N13, once it's gone through the landlord tenant board, the landlord is doing the renovations. You mentioned something about being able to go back into the unit or potentially getting some funds to move to a new unit. Can you speak a little bit more to that piece of the puzzle?
Sure. With the M13, if there's over 4 units in the complex, the landlord has to give you 3 months worth of rent. They also have to give you a 4-month period of time to try to find a place to move for the renovation period. So could you say the question again, Phil? Sorry, I just blanked.
No, these are big. There's a lot of different complex aspects to this.
Yeah, that's why I'm circling around.
Yeah. Well, what I was kind of getting at is once the renovation is happening, first of all, does that tenant have the right to just move and end the tenancy if they want to, or do they have to move back in?
No, they don't have to. What I normally tell tenants is, okay, get the N13, let them know that you want to move back in, even if you're not sure. If they do decide after that, you know what, I found a better place or I just don't want to move back in there, the landlord will gladly let them move out. Probably have them sign the N11, but gladly have them move out, because right after that, they can increase the rent to whatever they want. We see a lot of rents right now going from $500, and as soon as somebody moves out, it's around $1,000 to $1,100, at least.
Okay. And so let's say the tenant then decides, I want to move back in.
Yep.
The landlord then are they responsible for finding a place for the tenant during the renovations, or paying for that place while the tenant lives there during the renovations?
No, because the landlord is going to be giving them the compensation. And also, when that tenant's not in the unit, they don't have to pay rent. So that's kind of how it's looked after. Landlords are not responsible to put a tenant up, unfortunately. Some landlords do. Some landlords really feel for the tenant and say, look, guys, I know what I'm putting you through. I'll put you up for however many weeks we need to. And I've seen some landlords put people in Airbnbs, sometimes in the summer, put them up in a cottage, which, hey, pretty good landlord, eh? Yeah. But there are a lot of landlords that will try to work with the tenant, because they understand these are families, and they're in the business to rent out to people, and you're going to get good tenants if you treat them right. So a lot of landlords will try to work with the tenants, because quite truthfully, they see what's happening in the market. They know that there's not a lot of stuff out there, and everybody's got a family, and a lot of people have people that rent in their family. So yeah, I think normally a landlord's going to say, yeah, if you don't want to move in, you don't want to move back, that's good with me. And they might even give you some kind of benefit for that. Like, I'll help you move to your new place. I've seen landlords do all kinds of neat stuff like that.
Okay. And just before we close the chapter for right now on N13s, the question that comes to mind for me is, if the tenant, you know what? I'm actually kind of blanking. I had a question, and you got me so excited about the last part of your answer. But you know what? Before I'll probably come back to it. Let's talk about N11s then.
Sure.
You mentioned N11s are basically a good faith application to landlord tenant board to end the tenancy, because both the tenant and the landlord have signed saying we just want to end the tenancy. We're done with the tenancy. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes. Okay.
Now, what if a landlord came to me, or what if I signed an N11 and things change? Maybe I even signed it and I wanted to end the tenancy. I told my landlord I want to end it, but maybe my new rental fell through, or maybe my options fell through and I want to stay. Once I sign it, is it too late?
It's very difficult to turn that over, because there's already going to be a court order. And unless you apply with the landlord tenant board to review that order, and there's got to be reasons that why you're reviewing it. And usually it's, I've signed it under duress. I did not know what I was signing. Those ones can normally be taken back, but it's pretty tough to reverse something where both parties have signed. That's why I say, and I'll say it about 50 times today, don't sign anything. Please call the clinic. We will get a hold of you as soon as possible, usually sometimes the same day, and we'll be able to walk you through that and let you know your options. Because as soon as you've signed that, you've now got an eviction order over your head that you have to try to clear up. And quite truthfully, the way the landlord tenant board's running right now, it's even more difficult to try to clear that up. So again, don't sign anything. Please get a hold of the legal clinic. We will help.
So just to kind of summarize our conversation on N13 and N11s to this point, N13s is if a landlord is looking to renovate the unit, they have to have clear permits from the city to renovate. It has to be a significant renovation that requires months of the tenant leaving that space. And there are protections in place for the tenant, including potentially some compensation depending on where the tenant's moving to. And with the N11, it is simply just end a tenancy. And while it is fair to say that most landlords who are doing a renovation are coming in with good faith, they want to renovate it, even for the benefit of the tenant currently in the space, because they want to beautify that space, want to update it. There are some landlords who can kind of squeeze around that N13 by giving you an N11 and making you kind of sign that to get out of that tenancy quickly.
Yeah, and that does happen. But normally, normally if we see an N11, we're going to be phoning the landlord right away and saying, what were the circumstances that this was signed under? Because there's very solid case law about that, where they have to look at what circumstances the N11 were signed under. Was it duress? Did they know their legal rights? Now, some tenants may just want to end their tenancy. That happens all the time too. And a tenant can go to the web and Google LTB forms, print off an N11, sign it themselves, and say to the landlord, here's my notice, I'd like to leave. So it's not always a bad thing. It's a tool that has been used for bad things, though, in the past. And that's why we really want to put out there that there's a proper way to do this. And the board has thought long and hard for years about this, for the proper way to do this. And quite truthfully, N13s have been around since I've been doing this for over a decade. So there's no reason why they shouldn't use that. Now, some landlords just don't have the education. They've either been doing this for years and years and years, and this is the way my dad did it, so this is the way I'm doing it. Or they're new to it, so they don't know what to do. What I would suggest to landlords in that situation is there's a landlord self-help center that the province has put up, and it's free advice for landlords. And their number is 1-800-730-3218. And some tenants may be wondering, why am I giving this information out to landlords? Like, aren't they on the other side? Not at all. I work with landlords because we need to keep people housed. I'm not the suing type of guy. I'm the, hey, let's see if we can work this out. And normally that does work out. I phone a lot of landlords and just give them a heads up. Do you know that this isn't quite oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that. Is there a proper way to do this? And then we can have that discussion. But I find most landlords want to do the right thing. It's their house, it's their home, and they want to try to do the right thing for those people that are living in the rental unit.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then, Jeff, we talked about N13s, we've talked about N11s. You mentioned also something called cash for keys. What is this new kind of lingo I'm hearing? Cash for keys. What is this all about?
Cash for keys has been around for quite a while, actually, but you only really saw it in the bigger cities because, well, they're experiencing what we're experiencing now, no inventory at all. So you saw that come out of Toronto a few years ago, and that's where a landlord and a tenant will decide that the landlord wants his unit back, and he is willing to pay the tenant some money to get the unit back. And so what normally happens is they figure out an amount that is fair to both of them, and then they will sign an N11 to end the tenancy, and probably another contract beside that, just spelling out different things that the landlord's going to help with, storage or moving or stuff like that. They'll have some kind of minutes of settlement there. One thing that really makes me nervous about cash for keys is people take a look at the dollar amount. And some people, if a landlord offers $5,000, that sounds like a lot of money, especially if you're paying $700 a month for rent. You're thinking, yeah, this is a lot of money. But as soon as you leave that rental unit, that $700 rental unit is gone, and you're going to have to find a space that's probably double the rent. So that $5,000 goes pretty quickly. And if you can even find a place to move into. So cash for keys is legal. And if tenants want to do that, that's fine. Some tenants are ready to move into a house. They're ready to get a house. They're ready to start on with that part of their life. So sometimes that's beneficial for them. And normally what I tell a tenant to look at is, please take a look at the rental market if you are going to rent again, to see how much that's going to cost you. Because if you do the math, a lot of times it's not really worth doing the cash for keys. That being said, I've seen cash for keys in Toronto for $20,000, $30,000. But then again, Toronto's rents are $2,000 to $3,000. So kind of, yeah, it is legal. And if you want to do it, that's great. I would still suggest that you get a hold of the legal clinic, and we may be able to be a mediary there and help you sort things out, or at least make sure that cash is in hand before you sign this N11, because I've also seen that where, yeah, we'll give you the $5,000 and then you're evicted and there's no way to get a hold of the money. So please get a hold of the clinic. We can help set this up properly so that you really have nothing to worry about.
So if I had to sort of give the 2 talking points of tonight out of all the things we've decided,
Don't sign anything.
Sorry?
Don't sign anything. That's the key one.
You cut me to the punch. There it is. Don't sign anything. And secondly, call the legal clinic or Chatham-Kent Employment Social Services. They're 2 great resources in this community that are dedicated to keeping people housed, supporting individuals in this community. Stay housed. And the Chatham-Kent Legal Clinic, especially yourself, Jeff, you are providing a lot of great advice on what are your rights, but also what are your responsibilities for as a tenant in this community. And I think that's another point you've been making along so far is both tenants and landlords have rights and responsibilities. So I really appreciated those points I've heard so far. We have a couple of viewer questions coming in right now. Jeff, do you have anything else you wanted to add in before we jump to the viewer questions?
I kind of just want to reiterate that please get a hold of Employment and Social Services, because what most people don't realize is that I talk to them on a sometimes hourly basis. So I'm in contact with Employment and Social Services at least daily, and they have a ton of supports that I use quite often. And truthfully, a lot of the tenancies we've been able to save is because of the supports that they do give us. So get a hold of your worker, get a hold of Employment and Social Services, or get a hold of the clinic. One way or another, if you do that, you're going to be able to get some legal advice and at least know what your legal rights are. And it's a lot easier to be able to move forward and make an informed decision if you know what your rights are.
Absolutely. Very well said, Jeff. So let's jump into some viewer questions then. I have a question here. It's a little bit off of our conversation right now, but I think it's a good question to ask. When it comes to snow removal or cleanup or any repairs, how much is up to the tenant and how much is up to the landlord, as in who is responsible for that?
That will be spelled out in your lease. As of, I think it was 4 years ago, the Ontario government came up with the Ontario Standard Lease, and they want everybody to use it. So if you're not getting a standard lease and it actually has the emblem of Ontario and says Ontario Standard Lease on it, get a hold of the clinic or get a hold of Employment Social Services, because you need to be signing that standard lease. And in that lease, it's very specific. Snow removal, landlord, tenant will do X, X, and X. So it spells it out pretty good in that lease. But if you do have a lease that's not a standard lease and it doesn't have that information in it, normally that will fall back on the landlord. Any kind of maintenance for sure, because maintenance is always a landlord issue, but any kind of work, snow removal, cutting grass, flower beds, stuff like that, it'll normally be spelled out in the lease. And if the lease is silent to it, it falls back on the landlord.
Okay, good to know. Thank you, Jeff, for answering that.
Okay.
Some more questions have come in. If a tenant wants or needs a renovation to support a disability, does a landlord have a duty to provide that renovation?
Yes, that's called the duty to accommodate. And these, I feel bad for the landlords and the tenants in both these situations, because a lot of people will move into a place and they'll be mobile, and all of a sudden they're not for some reason. But the landlord is required up to undue hardship to accommodate that tenant with a ramp, with grab bars, moving the tenant sometimes. The landlord has 100% duty to accommodate that tenant. And if they don't, there's some very big ramifications for that. It even surpasses LTB. It could go to the human rights. So definitely the landlord does have a duty to accommodate not just physical, but also mental disabilities. So if you had a tenant who was screaming their lungs out every night and waking everybody up, yes, the tenant has to try to cure that behavior a bit, but the landlord also has to do certain things to try to stop it. There's a very good case in Toronto where there was a kid that was mentally ill and was screaming all hours of the night. The landlord tried to evict. The LTB, Landlord Tenant Board, said, no, you have a duty to accommodate. And because this landlord was so big, they ended up spending $70,000 in soundproofing. And they were ordered to do that by the Landlord and Tenant Board. They take very serious the duty to accommodate. So any landlords out there, if you do have something like that, you need to take it seriously. And if you want to talk to the tenant, have the tenant phone me. I have no problem working with the landlord and tenant to try to find some kind of amicable solution, because this is never a one glove fits all. And if everybody could get to the table and talk it out, most of the time there is a solution that's amicable to all parties.
That's good to know. I mean, it's a piece where in Ontario, the act that supports individuals to ensure there's accommodations to support individuals living with a disability, it is an act that we have to all abide by, and we all have to work towards as best as possible. So I'm glad to hear that the LTB is enforcing that to ensure individuals in this community who are living with a disability are able to stay housed in places that work for them.
It's quite odd because the Residential Tenancies Act, that are the statutes for the Landlord Tenant Board, trump every other act out there. Contract law, they trump every other act except for the code. So they are very aware of it, and the members are very aware of it. And as soon as you're in a hearing and they even have an inkling of some kind of disability, they will ask the landlord. And the tenant does have a duty to let the landlord know that they need accommodation. But if it's obvious, like they're collecting ODSP and being paid direct to the landlord, or there's an obvious, if it is obvious, the landlord does have to accommodate. So I would tell the landlords out there, ask some questions. It may help with the tenancy. Maybe if there's some issues with the tenancy, it's because of this disability. And like I said, we've got a lot of supports out there, and we could get this person hooked up with somebody they may not be hooked up with. And we've done that quite a bit, working with employment social services. It's not just them. There are so many branches to this tree in Chatham. You guys are pretty lucky because we don't have that in other municipalities at all.
It's true. There's this interconnection of a lot of social supports and services in Chatham-Kent that most people are not even aware of. It sometimes stays a little under the radar, but it's there, and it works very hard to support as many people as possible.
Yeah.
Now, Jeff, I have a question coming in from a viewer who is giving us a specific situation, but it's something I think we need to talk about because it brings us back to N13s and N11s.
Sure.
The question is, what if a landlord tried to increase an existing tenant's rent by $400 3 weeks after they took ownership? This is a new landlord who just took ownership of the property. Mm-hmm. After that, he gave the tenants an eviction notice stating he was intending to move in or complete renovations. It's been 9 months. The landlord has not moved in and has not done any renovations. Be it 9 months later, is there any recourse to the tenants for what has happened in this situation?
Oh, definitely. This situation sounds pretty in depth, so I would have the person who did ask the question, please contact me personally at the clinic and say that you're the one who asked the question, because there's a lot of moving parts here. Number one, when a landlord sells the building to another person, that person who bought the purchaser of the building inherits everything. They inherit the tenants, they inherit what the rent was, they inherit the lease, they inherit everything. So a new landlord can't just come in and say, hey, I'm the new landlord, I'm going to bump your rent up by $400. That's 1,000% illegal. And after he's done that, it sounds like he served an N12 saying he was going to move in. What I would suggest to that tenant, number one, get a hold of me. But number two, what I'll tell them when they do get a hold of me is get a hold of the Landlord Tenant Board and see if that landlord has filed the N12 or not. Because a lot of times landlords will serve the N12 and they're scary looking. They look like eviction notices. There's a big black banner that says you could be evicted. There's a termination date, but that's just the start of the process. And quite truthfully, with this, if I was a member sitting and hearing this tenant say the landlord increased my rent by $400 and he said he's moving in, I'm going to dig pretty deep into this file because something's not right there. They've done something illegal already, and now they've served a form saying they're moving in. I'm pretty suspicious when I see stuff like that. And these members hear this on a daily basis, 8 hours a day. So they're not dumb. And so what I would suggest, if somebody does have that where they've moved out because the landlord said they were going to renovate, or they've moved out because the landlord said they were going to move in and they haven't in what they call a reasonable amount of time, then you can file a T5 for bad faith. And a T5 for bad faith, like I had mentioned before, has a lot of teeth to it. They can, you can get general damages of up to 1 year's worth of rent. You can get the difference in your rent on top of that. You can be, they can order the landlord to move you back in, and they can fine corporate landlords up to $250,000. And I haven't seen fines that big, but I'm starting to see fines levied because members are getting tired of this. It's wasting their time. It's wasting the tenant's time. And quite truthfully, I had a block of N12s. And I was at the landlord tenant board, and there was about 20 N12s that were being heard. At least a quarter of them were thrown out because they did not have the evidence for it. And when the member questioned the landlord, they could tell the landlord was not going to move in. So that's why I say contact the clinic, because we can tell you how to navigate this, tell you what clues there are to see if this is legitimate or not. And in some cases, these are legitimate. So get a hold of us. We can set you up with supports. And that's where it'll start, because you will have a hearing for the N12 or the N13, and we can help you do the bad faith application. It's not very difficult to do that application because usually you can tell what's happened. The tenant just says, I've been out for 6 months. He hasn't let me in, and there's a new tenant in there, or he hasn't started repairs yet, which they have to do all of this in a reasonable amount of time. So a landlord saying, I'm going to do renovations and then sitting on it for 6 months, yeah, that's not going to fly very well.
So the moral of the story is call the Chatham-Kent Legal Clinic, especially in the case of this, because there are a lot of moving parts as you kind of went through each step, that your knowledge and the legal clinic's knowledge would be very useful in walking through the landlord-tenant board applications and how this would fall through the landlord-tenant.
And quite truthfully, a lot of times, if what I normally do is the tenant will phone up and ask for information, and I'll tell them what their rights are, and then I'll tell them to give the landlord a call and explain that they've talked to a legal clinic and that, I'm sorry, I think you're doing this wrong. That when you do that and you let them know that you've got some legal knowledge or you've gotten help from a clinic, a lot of landlords will take a pause and say, am I doing what I'm supposed to be doing here? And quite truthfully, I've had some landlords phone me at the office and say, hey, Jeff, I know you can't really help me out, but I want to help this guy out. I just don't know the right way to do it. And we'll find a way to get that information out to the landlords out there if they want to try to help out. We can't really represent or anything like that, but I'll make sure I steer you in the right direction for sure.
Good to know. Thanks so much, Jeff. And as you can see here on the screen, the Chatham-Kent Legal Clinic also has an exceptional website. They just updated it, www.cklc.ca. It is a treasure trove of information about your rights and responsibilities, and not just about tenancy. You have compiled a huge list of information that people in this community would really benefit from. Do you want to speak a little bit about your updated website, Jeff?
Yeah, RED did a great job on this. Before, our website looked like it was from the 80s, but yeah, it's very interactive now. And a lot of the resources for tenants are also on there. So you can just kind of click on the resources like ACTO, the Advocacy Center for Tenants Ontario. Great resource, great website. And they have people there that will answer your questions 5 days a week kind of thing. They're also the group that funds Tenant Duty Council. And I'm also Tenant Duty Council. And what Tenant Duty Council is, where We're there to give free, brief legal advice to tenants that want it or need it during the hearings. So they're very invested in this. So ACTO is a good one to go to, and even the landlord tenant board website. Sometimes there's some good information there. But if you go on to our website, you can also send us a message. It's funny, since this website has come up, I'm getting probably about an eighth of my summary advice requests from the website. And that's great because some people just don't have the time to phone, or they're working or whatever. And so if you're at home at night and you want some help, just go onto the website, type in your question and your phone number, and we'll get back to you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Jeff. And before we continue with some more viewer questions, if you have a question, enter it below. We're about halfway through tonight's tenant rights and responsibilities live session with Jeff Wilkins, a housing paralegal with the Chatham-Kent Legal Clinic. Jeff, we're going to jump back into some viewer questions, and I have one here. How does a landlord perform a major renovation on a property that they have purchased when they cannot raise the rent on the existing tenants? So how does that work?
Well, that's the landlord's deal. Unfortunately, if they bought this place, they probably done their due diligence and checked it out. If there is a tenant in there, it's obviously livable. So if the landlord does want to do renovations, some landlords just want to, and that's great. But if I understand where the question's coming here, I'm getting that, well, we're not raising rents quick enough and everything else. But this has been going on for at least 10 years. The last 3 years, rents have increased exponentially. So it didn't used to be that bad. Rent used to increase about 1.5 to maybe 2% per year. But yeah, if the landlord can't increase the rent, I get it. They may be upset about that, but that's up to them if they want to do the renovations or not. Nobody's forcing them to do renovations. They need to do maintenance, but renovations that are big enough that they need to get permits, that's a lot of work for the landlord to do. So that's up to them, what they want to do there. Some tenants have said, you know what, you've renovated my place. I don't mind paying extra rent, and I don't have a problem with that. And if tenants want to do that, that's great. But I would still get a hold of the legal clinic, because it's a slippery slope. Once you start saying, yeah, you know what, I've got a lease, but because you've increased this, I'll pay $200 more in rent per month. Well, where is that on the lease? If you ever do go to court and you're told that you have rent arrears, you need something in writing to say, okay, this is the new rent and we all agree on it. So again, get a hold of the clinic. We can help you out with that, because I had a tenant last week that said, you know what, he fixed this place up so great, I feel bad, I want to give him extra money. That's great. Way to go. You're probably going to have a great landlord-tenant relationship, and hopefully it'll go on forever and ever and ever until you have to get out of there. But it's unfortunate with those, but it's the landlord's choice. So there you go.
It's a fair point. And I think it's a great opportunity to just remind everyone who might be watching that, you know, these live sessions are really focused on bringing information to the public. This is about ensuring that people who are tenants understand their rights, but also the responsibilities, as much as landlords' rights and responsibilities. On top of that, I think when it comes down to it, we know in this community that we're experiencing an affordable housing crisis. And that goes for the tenants who are struggling to pay increasing costs of rent, but also the landlords who are increasing costs because they're facing increasing costs too. Across the board, it is an issue. But why we are here is not to debate which one is the best. It is to make sure people understand their rights and responsibilities from both sides of the coin, so that as much as possible, as you just said, Jeff, there are strong landlord-tenant relationships that ensure people remain housed, because that is the first step to growth of a community.
You nailed it. Yeah.
Okay, good to know. I was going to say, if I spoke on a term, please, Jeff, jump in on me, but I'm glad to hear. We have another viewer question that came in here. Wondering what my rights are when it comes to mice and bats in the unit. We have been coping with some issues in our rental. The landlord had a company come in, but refuses to pay professionals to fix the house properly because rodents are getting in maybe holes in the side of the building, for example. I've had conversations with my landlord. They're not fixing it. I'm really not sure what to do or where to take this right now. What would you recommend? And of course, I know what you're going to say, which is call the Chatham-Kent Legal Clinic. But what else would you have to say as well?
Well, what I would recommend to this person is go on the Landlord Tenant Board website and look up a T6. A T6 is a tenant's application for maintenance. The landlord does have to get rid of the pests, but if the pests keep coming in, the landlord has to look after that, because what they're doing is they're interfering with your reasonable enjoyment. So this could be a T6 for maintenance and also a T2 for tenants' rights. So what I would suggest to this person is say that they did some digging and they found out that the landlord should be looking after this, and give the landlord another shot at it. Is a lot of times, once you know your rights, that will sway a landlord to maybe look at their rights and find out that, yeah, they are liable for this. And if they don't fix it and it keeps happening and happening, there could be fines levied. There could be rent abatements given. Yeah, there's a whole slew of things there. But if they do want to phone the office, I can walk them through it. But I would suggest anybody with any maintenance problems, the best thing to do is go on the Landlord Tenant Board website and look up a T6 or look up a T2 for tenants' rights or a T5 for bad faith, so that you know before you call, this is what has to be done. This is what I need to do. And we can walk you through all of that. And it's a pretty easy process, to tell the truth.
Okay, good to know those. So I guess just to clarify, if the application has a T in front of it, that's for the tenant to fill out and for the tenant's use. If it's an N, that's the landlord using those forms, just to confirm the difference.
Correct. And what happens with the landlord's forms after that, the notices, is if they gave you an N5 or any of those notices, normally it turns into a L1, which would be for rent arrears, or an L2 for behavioral issues. So that notice from the landlord turns from an N notice to an L notice. Don't ask me why. That's just, yeah, somebody smarter than me thought that one up.
Well, it's the LTB, Landlord Tenant Board, loves their acronyms and letters, and they're just going at it apparently.
Yeah.
So I have another question that's come in. If I refuse to move out, so let's say I've refused to move out because my landlord wants to increase my rent. Can my landlord force me to put utilities in my name, even though it's an all-inclusive rent, in lieu of increasing my rent instead?
No, the landlord cannot unilaterally change the contract, meaning the landlord just can't one party change the contract. This still is a contract. It falls under different law, but this still is in essence a contract. And they cannot just unilaterally change that. Like the tenant just can't unilaterally say, I'm not going to pay $50 a month because my heat's not on enough. So neither party can just unilaterally change that. And if it is in the lease that says that the landlord is paying for utilities, then the landlord has to pay for it. Some landlords will make a deal with the tenant and say, look, need a new lease to be signed here because it's really getting tough there. I want you to sign a new lease. You do not have to sign a new lease for that. You can agree to pay a little extra if you want, but you don't have to. And some of the situations I've seen with this is when the lease is up after a year, the landlord comes and says, look, really expensive right now, so I want you to sign another lease and you're going to pay the utilities. You don't have to sign that lease. Once your lease is done, it becomes a month-to-month lease, and that can run for 20, 30 years, or the life of the tenant for that matter.
Okay, good to know. And kind of building off that, if I'm in a tenancy and I need repairs to my unit, but my landlord wants to increase the rent, or even end the tenancy, should I stop paying rent?
Never stop paying rent. That is the quickest way to be evicted. If you do have maintenance issues, like I'm going to say again, please phone the legal clinic, because if you have maintenance issues and you want to withhold your rent, there is a legal way to do that. You have to file that T6 for maintenance, and then you can put in a request to the landlord tenant board to pay your rent directly to the board. And the reason why they do this is, number one, it doesn't put the tenant in peril of losing their tenancy for not paying rent. And number two, if the tenant does win with their application for maintenance and the tenant gets some kind of award, they'll take that award out of the rent that the tenant has paid into the board and give the landlord the rest of it. So that's another protection that they have there.
Excuse me. That protection piece, I think, is really important, because if I'm not mistaken, if they don't follow those proper procedures as a tenant to withhold rent, or in effect pay it to landlord tenant board instead, for the landlord to start doing the repairs, if they just stop paying rent, that could actually lead to an eviction notice.
That will lead to an eviction notice. No ifs, ands, or buts about it, because with the way things are going now, landlords are being very tight, and rightfully so, because rents now, before losing $500 may have been one thing, but now $1,500, they're going to be a little more tight on their timelines. And as soon as they give you, what'll happen if you do withhold your rent, they will serve you an N4. And again, scary looking, looks like an eviction notice, but it's not. But the termination date will be 14 days from when he served it. And what that does is it gives the landlord 14 days, then he can file with the landlord tenant board. And even if you end up paying him after that, you still have to pay the filing fee of $201. So there's an extra bite to you. And quite truthfully, holding back rent, life happens. And if you're holding back rent and all of a sudden the car breaks down, or a bill comes in unexpected, it's so easy to take those funds and use them. And then there's a good chance you could be evicted, because the landlord can ask the member to have you pay all of those arrears in 11 days. And sometimes that happens. Now, that being said, if you are in arrears and you do need help, please get a hold of us. Please get a hold of Employment Social Services, because there are supports for that where they may be able to help you out. If you are in arrears, the landlord tenant board has also forced repayment plans on landlords. So the landlord does have to offer you some kind of repayment plan. So there are ways to save the tenancy through this, but you need to get a hold of the clinic right away, because what'll happen is, since I'm tenant duty counsel and you let us know, we'll set you up with a phone call to Employment Social Services. If they can't help, we will be tenant duty counsel that day at the hearing, and we'll come up with a repayment plan. And a lot of times members will agree to a fairly long repayment plan. Normally, it used to be 2 to 3 months. Now it's about 6 to 9 months that they can get for repayment plans. So, but a lot of times we can help secure funds for this. So get a hold of us, or get a hold of Employment Social Services, because the help is out there.
Very well said. And you know, it just brings us back to that, again, that comment we were talking about earlier, which is, you know, be it the tenant or the landlord, there are legal ways to follow the steps of the system. The system is set there for protections of both parties. And that's why they have structures in place like the L forms, the T forms, the N forms, all those forms that exist for a reason. They're not just there to scare people, they're there for a real reason. And both sides can follow those steps and navigate the system properly for both of their protections. I hear you correctly.
And yeah, you do hear me correct. And one thing that I see constantly, and it's a little frustrating, is there'll be some landlords that haven't done the homework for the notices. So they give the notice and it's defective. And then they wait 3, 4, 5 months for the hearing. And then they find out that the notice is defective and they have to start from scratch. Not only does that hurt the landlord, but then the tenant is also waiting another 3, 4 months where rent may not be paid. So this just snowballs and snowballs. So better to look after this right away and come up with some kind of plan, because the help is out there. And the number one goal for Chatham-Kent number one goal for Chatham-Kent Legal Clinic is to save tenancies. That's what it is. Well, my part of the clinic anyway, because we have to. We're starting to see homelessness on the streets of Chatham, where 5 years ago I didn't see that when I started working, and it's out there now, unfortunately.
Absolutely. And I think you just framed the landlord tenant board and what you do in a very different light than I think many of us tend to not see. What I mean by that is a lot of times we think we got to call the Chatham-Kent Legal Clinic because we're in a crisis, or it's really scary to go to landlord tenant board because we have no clue what the system is like. But that's why the legal clinic has such a great updated website. There are other websites, as you mentioned, like the advocacy website through that you can access through your website at cklc.ca, as well as other places you can find information to be proactive, know your rights, know your responsibilities for both tenant and landlord, so that the system is smoother and those relationships are really strong between each other.
If you get a hold of us before the fact, and this is what we kind of pride ourselves on, is we don't have a lot of tenants that end up going to the landlord tenant board because we work beforehand. As soon as that notice comes out, if they get a hold of us, we're on the phone right away talking to employment social services or to housing or whoever. And a lot of times, I'd say at least 70% of the times, we're able to solve this before it goes to court. And that's where we've been able to really help out a lot of people, because if we weren't able to solve it beforehand and it was all in court, we'd be losing a lot of tenancies. And since we do have the supports in Chatham, get a hold of us beforehand. We can normally, well, sometimes we can get this settled outside of court. You don't have to waste your day in court. You don't have to get all your evidence into the tribunal, because it's nowadays during Zoom and having to upload evidence, and even if it shows up there, it's a chore. It's a chore and it's very stressful. And you could be sitting there all day and not have your hearing heard. And so that'd be adjourned, and then you're going to have to wait, and it keeps snowballing. So get a hold of us early. We're going to try to get this sorted out before it even gets to the hearing stage.
Great information to know, because that mediation is really a key factor of preventing evictions, of making sure people are staying in housing, and it works for both sides. I have another viewer question here, Jeff. If a unit was rented without laundry facilities, and now the tenant wants those facilities, or wants a laundry dryer in their unit, does the landlord have to install them even though the house never had them?
No, the landlord doesn't have to do anything like that. If you do want to install washer and dryer, any kind of, if you did want to install that in your unit, you'd have to let the landlord know and ask for permission for it, because you don't have the right to just bring a washer and dryer into your unit. There could be problems with code. There could be problems with electricity. There could be problems with noise to other neighbors. Not to mention the landlord having to pay extra water and hydro. So if you were to do that without asking the landlord, pretty good chance you're going to have a notice of hearing on your door, and you're going to have to answer for it. And the chances, well, no, not the chances, you are going to have to get rid of it because that was not there originally.
Okay, good to know. Now, before we end, because it's getting closer to our 8 o'clock time to end this hour live session, I thought we could just quickly recap as best as possible N13s, N11s, and cash for keys. What are the big takeaways you want people to remember about those three topics?
N13s secures your rights to first refusal, secures your rent. And you probably get a nicer place out of the N13. The N11 ends your tenancy, and it's very difficult to get away from that because you've already signed this piece of paper, which is virtually a contract saying that you're going to leave by a certain date. And cash for keys, yeah, it's out there, but be careful. Remember this, that people that are coming to buy houses now, the houses are very expensive, so they do have money there. You can negotiate with the landlord to try to get a better deal, but there's not a lot of stuff out there to rent. So if you're doing a cash for keys, make sure you got a place in your back pocket for sure, because as soon as you do the cash for keys, sign that N11, you're out of luck.
And Jeff, I think we can both at this point say it with me, Jeff. Call
Don't sign
legal
anything. Call the
clinic.
legal clinic.
Don't sign anything. Call that legal clinic phone number, or visit cklc.ca to reach out through the website to talk with Jeff and his team over at the Chatham-Kent Legal Clinic, or for more information on tenant rights and responsibilities.
And give us a call. We don't bite.
Yeah.
We're pretty easygoing people, and that's what we're there for. We want to try to help, and we want to save tenancies. Nobody should be homeless.
Absolutely. And I think we also have been shouting out a couple of times tonight about Chatham-Kent Employment and Social Services. A lot of times people just paint them with one stroke and say, oh, they just do Ontario Works. Yes, but they do a significant amount of other things as well, including they have an entire department focused on supporting tenancies and reducing homelessness across the municipality. They provide a variety of different services to ensure tenants can stay housed, and work very closely with the Chatham-Kent Legal Services. The number is on the screen for CK Employment and Social Services and for the Chatham-Kent Legal Clinic as it bounces back and forth. We have the numbers up there for you. Jeff, any last words you'd like to share before we look to end our live session for today?
Not really. Everybody take care out there. It's getting pretty hectic with housing, and the market is going squirrely. So use whatever supports you have. And Chatham-Kent's very lucky because they have a ton of supports, and we all work together in this and know each other very well. So please use these supports, because this crisis isn't going to go away. It's only going to get worse, and we need to keep people housed. We really do.
Very well said, Jeff. And I just want to echo that. In our community, for those who might not be aware of every single social service or service out there, frankly, Chatham-Kent, what I've experienced is there's really no wrong door. You can enter a service and they have connections and networks that are quite broad and will connect you to the right services if they can't support, or even if they are supporting you, they'll still connect you to as many services as possible for what you need to get ahead and thrive and prosper in this community. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Again, for what a great session talking about N13s, N11s, cash for keys. Again, let's end the session with a big bang. What do we always say, Jeff?
I'll let you finish this one, Phil.
The name of the game is don't sign anything, and please make sure to call the Chatham-Kent Legal Clinic or visit their website for more information. Thanks,
and we'll
everyone.
add one more little thing to it.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Look after this stuff right away. It could be scary, and I get it. Some people want to turtle because they know that they haven't paid their rent, or they know that there's been behavior problems. Don't worry. You're not the only person in the world. We can help you sort that out most of the time. So don't throw it in a drawer. Give us a call, and we'll help you sort it out.
And for what it's worth, Jeff and I came to the community at the exact same time, around the same time at least, Jeff. And he is above board. He is never going to judge. He's there to support you as best as possible as a tenant. So please reach out. Do not hesitate, because really you're going to get the best service possible with Jeff Wilkins and the channel.
Hey, I'm a tenant. So
Me too. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for watching. And again, thank you so much, Jeff, for everything you're doing and for joining us from the Chatham-Kent Legal Clinic. I'm Philip Mock from the Prosperity Roundtable. Have a great night, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.